everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm super excited to share with all of you my initial review of the NATASHA DENONA Retro Palette. So that's this cool toned mauvey beauty over here. And if you guys watched my Sephora VIB Sale Part 2 video, then you know that I've already created one everyday friendly look with this palette. But today I wanted to pull out all the stops and do a more dramatic look using this palette, along with doing some swatches and comparison swatches. So hopefully this video is helpful for any of you who are interested in learning more about this retro palette. So before diving into the swatches, let's first just talk a little bit about the history of this palette. So this is technically in the same family as the NATASHA DENONA Mini Retro Palette. That is one of her most popular mini palettes. But as you can see in comparing this palette with the picture of the mini palette, there's not a lot of similarity in terms of their color story. The mini palette has more of a peachy pink undertone to it and has those grayish green shades. It's overall more of a spring look with some grunge to it. This palette is much more mauve, burgundy, and slightly cool toned. That said, these tones are really right up my alley. When I first saw this palette, it reminded me a lot of the Divine Rose 1 palette from McGrath and also the Paris Edit palette from Viseart. And those are two of my favorite everyday friendly palettes. And so I'll definitely do some comparison swatches later on with those palettes. Because this color story really speaks to me, originally I was going to pick this up around the time that it dropped in order to give you guys a review. But it just so happened that the drop date was right around when I was going on vacation. And so at first I decided, okay, I'm just gonna pass on this palette for now. But then I was seeing all these reviews, feeling a lot of FOMO, and so actually while I was on vacation, I went to a few Sephora stores to try to find it. Unfortunately, they did not have this in stock, and so after that I decided, okay, I'm just gonna wait until this goes on sale. So despite the fact that I had a lot of FOMO about this palette, I feel like everyone has been talking about this palette and recommending this palette, I did decide to wait until the Sephora VIB sale. I actually originally ordered this the first day of the VIB sale, but then once again it turned out to be sold out. So even though I had placed my order, my local Sephora was unable to fulfill the order, and so I ended up ordering this online, and now it has finally arrived. So all that's just to say, even though I don't have much experience with this palette, I feel like I have already been on a pretty long saga with this palette, and I'm really excited to now actually play around with it and get to know it better. So without further ado, let's dive into the packaging and swatches of this palette. So first off, this comes in the standard Midi packaging for NATASHA DENONA. If you have the Bronze palette, the Glam palette, or the Zendo palette, they're all in the same size and packaging. On the back, there are these holes so you can easily pop the shadows out and rearrange them across your palettes. It's a magnetized closure, and inside you have 15 beautiful shades, shade names, and a large mirror. And here we have the first 4 shades swatched, starting with Glitzy, which is a dual chrome baby pink with a champagne shift. Then we have Andy, a matte taupe lilac cream powder. Jude, a metallic warm taupe. Maud, a matte off-white with pink undertone. So here we have the next 4 shades. Vivian, which is a matte light pink nude cream powder. Groove, a matte medium dark warm maroon. Opart, a matte dark taupe cream powder. And Psychedelic, a warm baby pink with multicolor sparks topper. Let me just add a little bit more to that one. And here we have the next 4 shades. Go-Go, which is a matte medium warm rose cream powder. Patty, which is a metallic medium nude rose copper. Swing, a metallic medium dark cool maroon. And Nude Mauve, a matte medium light neutral nude. Gonna add a little bit more to that swatch. And here are the last 3 shades. Rebellion, which is a matte medium burgundy cream powder. Helio, which is a metallic taupe nude. And Amara, a matte medium cool vintage rosewood. And as always, Natasha Denona's formula swatches incredibly beautifully. All of her shades are really creamy to the touch. So as you can see here, the overall color story is very consistent and great for everyday neutral to cool leaning looks. You have some lilacs, some burgundies, but also some roses and peaches in there, along with some taupey neutrals. One quick note about formulation is that 5 of these shadows are in her cream powder formula. Based on the first look that I did with this palette in my Sephora VIB Sale haul, I do think she has improved that formula. So if you have been turned off by that formula in the past, it might be worth still checking it out in some of her more recent palettes. That said, that's something I'll definitely be testing out today because I was not a huge fan of that formula either. And with 5 out of 15 shades being in that formula, you really need to like it in order to like this palette. So without further ado, let's get into the eyeshadow demo. To start things off, I'm going to go in with my Wayne Goss number 16 into Mod. And I'm basically going to use this to set some of the foundation in the crease area, just to ensure a more easy blend later on. So as you can see, this adds a little bit of lightness to my skin, but this shade is not terribly opaque. Next, with that same brush, I'm going into Andy, and this is one of her cream powder formulas. Wow, that is blending out super easily. Very, very nice. This is a little bit cooler tone than the rest of today's look, but that's okay. We'll warm it up a little bit with some of the burgundies and roses later on. As always for these review videos, I try my best to use as many shades as possible on my lids, just so you guys can see them in action. Let me actually zoom you guys in some more. So there's Andy on the lids, and I have to say I am very impressed with just how easy that blend was. So to tone down this lilac a little bit, I'm gonna go into Amara. And with that same brush, concentrate this more on the outer third, but also kind of bring it in a little bit. Amara is in one of her normal powder matte formulas. So that added just a tiny bit of reddish depth, a tad bit patchy in comparison to Andy, but that's okay. We're gonna continue layering on. So Groove and Rebellion look very similar to each other in pan. So I'm gonna try going in first with Rebellion and maybe also add a little bit of Groove just to compare the two. So I'm keeping this more on the outer third. Generally speaking, the creamy matte formulas are gonna look a little bit more vibrant and less dark on the skin than they look in pan. And I'm definitely seeing that with Rebellion because in pan it looks super deep, but I would say on the lids you're getting more of that kind of burgundy tone to this. So blended out, you can see a lot more of that vibrant reddishness. And with that same brush, I'm gonna go into Ope Heart. And this is the deepest shade in the palette, so I'm going to rely on this for some smoke. This one is a tad bit harder to blend out than the others, though it is the deepest one, so I'll cut it a little bit of slack for that. In general, one thing I have found with her cream powder formula is you do need to spend a little bit of time just nudging it around and blending it out. When you do, it usually works itself out, but it can sometimes be a little bit chunky upon initial application. Alrighty, I think that added some decent depth. Do you want to soften up this outer edge? So I'm going back in with my Wayne Goss number 16 and just blending everything again because I don't actually want a really strong cat eye for today's look. And I am still kind of curious about Groove, so I'm going to go in now with my Wayne Goss number 17 and see how it looks if I just layer this on top of the edge right now, because I feel like there's sort of this very deep area and then it becomes really light. So I'm going to add Groove to the crease. I would say Groove is definitely a little bit more cool toned in comparison to Rebellion, even though in pan they look very similar. I feel like by adding Groove in, I have lost a little bit of that burgundy tone that I had from Rebellion. Overall, this look is a bit more purple leaning than what I was expecting. I would say Rebellion adds some of that burgundy and Amara adds some rosiness, but the rest of these mattes really pull things more in a cool tone direction. So now let's try out some of these shimmers. So I want to do Jude all over the center of my lids because I'm really intrigued by this shade. I feel like it's the one that can hopefully add some additional interest to this look. I'm going in with the rougher number 21 and just dabbing this on the center of the lid, dragging it out a little bit. Normally I would do this step with a finger, but I am curious how much fallout I get using a brush for this. And then with my builder brush from Sonia G, I'm going into Swing. And I just want to add some of this on the boundary between the outer corner and Jude. Ooh, that's a really pretty shade. That does a great job of kind of melding the mattes into the shimmers. And then with the inner corner, I'm going to go into Helio. And this one, I'm just going to dab on with my finger. So you can hopefully see it's just a little bit lighter and pinker than Jude. And here it is again on this side. And then with my Wayne Goss number 19, I'm just going to slowly clean up that crease area and just make sure all of the shimmers blend in nicely. There we go. Overall, a really soft, pretty look. All of the shades really blend in together very seamlessly. Now I am really curious about these two flaky topper shades, Glitz and Psychedelic. And so I'm going to first go in with Psychedelic and just dab this lightly on the center of my lids so we can see how much impact that provides. Alrighty, that's cute. A little bit more shine. I feel like this is kind of like the Blitz Astral shades with Pat McGrath where you can add a bit more glitz at the end. This is definitely not as high shine as the Pat McGrath ones, but it is catching some light. And then with my Sonia G Soft Definer, I'm going to take a little bit of glitz and use this as inner corner highlight. There's not really a designated inner corner or brow bone highlight in this palette. I think you can use Glitz or Psychedelic for inner corner for sure, but they are a little bit chunky, so we'll see how this works for brow bone highlight. Taking a little bit of glitz, just gonna sweep this on the brow bone. Alrighty, not as bad as I thought. I feel like if you really blend it in, it looks a little bit less chunky. Personally though, I do tend to prefer a smooth shimmer shadow for the brow bone. Now for the lower lash line, I'm gonna first go into Amara with that soft definer brush and just sweep this all over the lower lash line. And then taking a little bit of Groove, I'm going to concentrate this on the outer portion. And then with this tiny Wayne Goss number 5, I'm taking a bit of Opart and just dragging that right along the lower lash line. Then with my Refer number 21, I'm going to take a little bit of Patty, which is described as a metallic, but honestly it looks more like a matte to me. So let's put this just right here. This is the one really peachy shade in the palette. So hopefully you guys can see that right there. If you want more of an everyday nude natural look, I think Patty is a good shade to go in with. And then just for the fun of it, I'm going to take a tiny bit of glitz and also see if I can just put this over Patty around the inner third of the lower lash line, just to bring in a little bit of light, since again, I don't really think Patty is metallic. Alrighty, so here we have the completed eyeshadow look. I actually managed to use most of the shades in this look. So I didn't go into Vivian. I did use this in my first look and it basically looks like Maud, but just in a different formula on my lids. I also did not go into Go-Go or Nude Mauve, but I did use those shades as well in my first look. So if you're curious how those look, definitely check out my Sephora VIB Sale haul part 2 video where I do my first look with this palette. But I'm really glad today that I went in with all these other shades because I think they really create a really fun, very multi-dimensional look on the lids. I was sort of underwhelmed with my first look, which was more of kind of an everyday, very simple, very subdued look. This is definitely more my jam in terms of what I'm looking for with my NATASHA DENONA palettes. So here we have the finished look. What do you guys think? So before we get into my overall thoughts about this palette, let's go into some comparison swatches. So first off, the moment there were spoilers for this palette, I immediately thought of Divine Rose 1. And so here they are side by side. And here are the comparison swatches. So on the top I have Retro, and on the bottom I have Divine Rose. And of course Retro has 5 additional shades, so for the 10 Divine Rose shades I tried to find the closest dupe in Retro. Overall though, I would say the palettes are a lot more distinct than I thought they would be, even though the color stories are overall quite related. In general, I would say that Divine Rose actually is a much more neutral color story, whereas Retro is a little bit more lilac and burgundy leaning and doesn't really have any neutral browns or golds or other shades that would warm it up. So next to the Skin Show shade, I have Maud, which is matte instead of shimmer. Next to Valoria, I have Andy, which is much more lilac. Next to the bronze, I have Jude, which is much more cool toned. Next to the gold, I have Nude Mauve, which is a matte and also not really gold. Next to the shimmery pink shade, I have Vivian, which is also matte instead of shimmer. Next to the mahogany shade, I have Opart, which is cooler toned. This bronze shade and Helio are probably the closest dupes. Next to the dual chrome, I have Glitzy, which is both cooler toned and doesn't really have much base pigment to it. And finally, next to this astral shade, I have Psychedelic, which has more base pigment to it and has more of a pinky flip and is less textured and glittery. So overall, even though these give a similar vibe, they definitely are pretty different palettes. The other palette that struck me as being very similar is this Paris Edit palette from Viseart. And here we have the swatch comparisons. Again, Retro is at the top and Viseart is on the bottom. Overall, I would say there's a lot more similarities between the Edit palette and the Retro palette than between Divine Rose and the Retro palette. Overall, I would say the Edit palette is a little bit more colorful in comparison to Retro. In general, in comparison to other palettes, Retro definitely has a lot more of a consistent color story considering how many shades it has. So the Paris Edit, for example, does have this really cool toned, almost bluish steel gray shade, and also this pink shade. And so I think that can change up the overall vibe. That said, if we go shade by shade, I would say removing these two, the rest of them do have a shade that is quite similar in color. Of course, the formulations are a little bit different between the Viseart palette and the Retro. In general, I would say the Viseart palette has a lot more variety in terms of the types of shimmer finishes. You have this really chunky shimmer here, you have this super satin shimmer here, whereas most of the Retro shades are in her metallic formula with the exception of those 2 glitter toppers. Overall, I would say if you already own the Paris Edit, you probably don't need to run out and grab the Retro one unless you just want it in the Natasha Denona formula. If you're debating between the two, I would say if you like more powdery matte formulas, so not the cream powders that Natasha Denona has, the Viseart one might be a better fit. Also, if you like more satin shimmers, similarly, the Viseart might be a little bit better. This palette was in my best of 2020 eyeshadow rankings, so I can definitely vouch for this palette. The only caveat I would say is the Viseart shadows are a little bit more variable in terms of how they perform in these Edit palettes. I feel like they often do experiment a bit with different types of formulations. And at least based on my initial impressions of this Retro palette, there is a little bit more consistency, I would say. So as long as you like the Natasha Denona formulas, then this one might be a good way to go if you're willing to pay the additional cost. Packaging wise and in terms of amount of product, of course the Natasha Denona wins out. But I think these are both great additions to a makeup collection. So with the comparison swatches out of the way, let's get into my overall initial impressions of this palette. So on the whole, I would say I'm much more impressed with this palette this time than with the initial look that I did. This palette reminds me a lot of the bronze palette in the sense that the main critique with this palette is that there's a lot of shades that come across really similarly on the lids. So even though you have 15 shadows, you're not really going to be able to create as many diverse looks. That said, I think that's just part of Natasha Denona's style of makeup artistry. She likes having a lot of similar shades in slightly different formulas or slightly different tones. And so you shouldn't necessarily think of this as a palette with 15 really distinct shades. Maybe think of it more so as a palette with around 10 shades. And if you think of it in that way, I think this is a really great, fun palette to play around with. The first look I did was very everyday, slightly cool toned, rosy and peachy. This look, I would say, has much more of that lilac burgundy vibe to it. So it definitely pulls more on the purple side of the spectrum. In general, I would say if you want something cooler toned, this half of the palette will yield a cooler toned look, and this half will yield a warmer toned, more neutral look. I was really impressed today with just how well all of the shadows performed. The mattes blended together beautifully, and again, I do feel that she has improved her cream powder formula. In previous palettes, I often have had issues where when I apply those shadows with a brush, they sometimes ball up a little bit and then you kind of have to blend out the bald pigment. I have not experienced that though with this palette, and all of the cream powders have just been very easy to work with. The shimmers also were really great and could be applied with either a brush or a finger. I did get a little bit of fallout when applying it with a brush, but nothing that couldn't just be easily swept away. So overall, I am very happy to finally have this palette in my collection, and I am excited to continue playing around with it and do some more looks. Definitely let me know in the comments down below if you would like to see additional looks playing around with this palette. And if you've picked up this palette or any other Natasha Denona palettes, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about her formulation and curation. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for the support, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!